first video on Chapter 1, we did a brief overview of some of the ideas in economics that we'll be studying this semester. In the second video, we're going to dive into some more of the details about economics and some of the ways that we think about doing economic analysis.
All right, let's jump right into it here. Just to review a little bit what we talked about last time, to get it back in our heads, economics is a social science, means we study people and their behavior, and it's all predicated on the idea that we have unlimited wants and limited resources. That brings up the requirement that no matter who we are, we have to make choices. We can't have everything and we can't do everything. Microeconomics is when we look at the decisions, the choices of individual people, individual businesses, or we look at how those individual people and businesses interact in a market for a single product. For example, the gasoline market or the automobile market or the education market. And try to figure out, using supply and demand, to try to figure out, well, how do these interactions of the choices of the suppliers, the businesses, and the demanders, the individual customers, how do they play out to determine how high the price is and how much people are buying of a certain good? Now, within microeconomics, we study all kinds of different decisions. It's not just decisions in the business world. Just to give you a couple of examples here of things that microeconomists might study, some different fields in microeconomics. One field in microeconomics that's very popular is called health economics. We study health markets and try to answer questions like, what are the kinds of choices people can make in order to make themselves healthier? Why is healthcare so expensive? What are some of the barriers to creating a system of government-provided healthcare that would work very well for everyone? So that's health economics. Also sports economics, looking at what are the kinds of investments that sports teams can make in order to have a winning season. What are the determinants of the salaries of athletes in different sports? Why do some people get paid more than others, for example? Personally, my big field that I study in microeconomics is called regional economics or regional science. And in regional economics, there are a couple of different things people do. One thing is to try to figure out why it is that some cities are more successful than others. What are the things that cause cities to grow and develop in a healthy way? What I look at is how people weigh the costs and the benefits associated with transportation costs, driving. So why is it that some people might choose to live right next to where they work and other people might choose to commute 60 minutes? And how do those transportation costs affect people's decisions? One study that I did that was very interesting was looking at the transportation cost associated with buying alcohol. How do people behave when it costs more to drive to the closest place where you can buy alcohol? Maybe it takes one person only 2 minutes to get to the closest store. Another person has to drive for 30 minutes or an hour to get to the closest place that sells alcohol. How do these two types of consumers behave differently? Macroeconomics is when we look at the big picture of an entire economy. So this is typically what people think of when they think of economics before you've had an economics class, is macro. What's going on in the whole economy? As a microeconomist, I always have to explain to people that when they ask me, well, what's going to happen in the economy next summer? I have to explain to them, well, number one, I don't know, and very few people can tell the future. But I'm also not that kind of economist because I am a microeconomist. But I know enough about macroeconomics to be able to discuss some things intelligently. And as we discussed in the last video, basically, when you think about macroeconomics, the three big ideas you want to think about are what's happening to GDP, gross domestic product, how much stuff we're making in an economy, what's happening to unemployment, and what's happening to inflation, and what are the relationships between these things. Now, in economics, a lot of times we'll discuss what we call the economizing problem. So the economizing problem plays on this idea of unlimited wants and limited resources. So we're always trying to figure out, for every different kind of situation in microeconomics, how is it that people are using their limited resources in order to do the best at something, whatever their goal is? So for an individual, usually we will discuss the economizing problem this way. We'll say, well, what does a person have? What are their resources? Well, their resources might be things like time, their energy, their brain power, their knowledge and their education, right? And their money might be another resource that people use. How can you use your time, your knowledge, your money in order to maximize something? What is it we assume that people are trying to maximize if we're talking about individual people? Well, we call it your utility. Now, this word utility comes from the 1800s. And back in the 1800s, it meant something a little bit more like usefulness. So people want to buy things because they're useful to them, because they help them. These days, instead of thinking about usefulness, we think about utility as just being your happiness or your satisfaction, whatever that may be. So you may just be a person that wants pleasure. However, other people's pleasure or satisfaction might come from learning. Their pleasure or satisfaction might come from helping other people, for example. So no matter what it is, everybody has different goals. Everybody has different things that are going to make them happy. So we study how can various people make choices, use their resources in the best way possible in order to maximize whatever their goals are, whatever they consider to be happiness. Now, when we think at the whole society level, what kind of resources do we have as a society, say in a country? Well, in that case, we think about our resources as being whatever the scarce natural resources are that we might have, our clean air, our wood, our coal. We also think about our human resources that we have. And what are our manufactured inputs? These are the three kind of categories of resources that we think about that as a society we want to use in order to maximize something. Now, whatever it is. Now, we would usually think that as a society we would want to maximize the well-being, the happiness, the satisfaction, the personal growth and development and freedom of our people, perhaps. But different societies have answered this question in very different ways. What is it we're trying to maximize? Let's just kind of leave it general here that, well, what we kind of want to do, leaving it kind of vague, is we want to produce goods and services. So goods would be things like food, and services would be things like doctors' appointments and educators like me. So we're going to use these three kinds of resources, and there's actually a fourth kind of economic resource that we usually add on top here. So we're going to use the land and natural resources. So when an economist says land, we don't just mean dirt. We mean land or things that come from the land, all kinds of natural resources. So we would include something like timber, chopping down a tree, as part of land. Also coal comes from the land. So natural resources. When we think about these resources, we also want to think about, well, who's going to pay for these resources? How are these resources going to be obtained in a market? So when we think about land, we call payments to land rent. And again, this word rent has kind of an interesting historical background to it. Back in the olden days, in Europe especially, and well, in Asia as well, if you look at different periods of time, all the land was owned by nobility. So you had two kinds of people. You had nobility, and then you had everyone else. How would these dukes and princes and earls and kings, how would they make money? Well, what they would do is they would rent out their land to people to use. So they would rent some of their land out to farmers. They would rent other land to people who would open a quarry to get stone. They would rent some of their land to people who would chop down trees and sell the timber. They would rent land to hunters who would go and hunt deer and things like that. So this is the historical reason why we call these payments to land or other natural resources rent. Sounds kind of a weird word these days in modern times. Now, labor makes a little bit more sense. So labor, we're talking about the time and abilities of people, whether it's physical labor or mental efforts of people who are producing goods and services. And we call payments to those people wages. So that makes a little bit more sense. Capital, this is what we call machines and tools and equipment and buildings that are used to produce things. Again, a little bit strange until you think about it a little bit is when we talk about paying for those machines and buildings, we call payments to that interest. Why? Well, typically you think about when you start a business, you're going to need to borrow some money to buy the machines, to buy the buildings. And what's the cost of the money you borrow? Well, it's the interest that you're paying on that money. Even if you're not borrowing the money, suppose you're using your own money to buy the machines and the equipment and the buildings. Then when you take that money out of the bank or take the money out of the other investments that you had that money in and you spend it on the machines and the buildings and the equipment, you're going to be losing that interest. So no matter whether you're using your own money or you're borrowing other people's money, it's costing you interest in one way or another. And the fourth, sometimes overlooked resource, but this is one of the most important, is entrepreneurial ability. An entrepreneur is anybody who organizes the other resources. So it's somebody who comes up with an idea, somebody who gets some natural resources, some workers, some buildings and machines, and puts them all together to start a business. This is crucial. You can't overlook this because if nobody is willing to do that, nothing is going to get done. So the two key things that an entrepreneur does is they're using this organizational and motivational energy of theirs that is a special talent. When you meet a real entrepreneur, it's something special to behold. I advise watching a show like Shark Tank on television, where you can see some of these people who are entrepreneurs and listen to the kinds of questions that these sharks, these potential investors, ask these entrepreneurs. These are some of the key things you want to think about. Now, when it comes to entrepreneurial ability, the other big thing that the entrepreneur does that not very many people are willing to do is they take risks. So let me write that in there because this is an important part of being an entrepreneur. They take risk. They risk their time, they risk their money, they risk their energy and their reputation. Most businesses who begin don't end well, right? Most businesses are not successful. So one of the biggest things that an entrepreneur has to do is to be willing to take risk. You might lose it all, but you might gain. And an entrepreneur has to be compensated for that risk. Now, when we talk about an entrepreneur and how they are going to be paid, we call this payment to entrepreneurs profits. So the reason why an entrepreneur gets involved in organizing these other factors of production and why they're willing to take the risk is because they want to be rewarded, and we call that reward profits. They might not make profits, they might lose money, but at least on average, entrepreneurs have to be compensated. They have to be rewarded and paid. Just like these other factors of production, if you don't pay for your land, you're not going to have any natural resources. If you don't pay for your labor, your capital, you're not going to have these things. And so if you're not willing to reward your entrepreneurs, you're not going to have businesses. So sometimes in the political debates that we have in every country, we talk down on these entrepreneurs. We talk bad about people who start businesses. We want to tax away all their profits, and we say it's not fair that they get profits, so we should just raise their taxes. Okay, well, if you take away all their profits, watch what's going to happen in the long run. People aren't going to start businesses anymore. People are going to start closing businesses down if you make it harder, or especially near impossible, to make any money out of starting a business. So nobody's going to do anything unless there's some promise of reward. Second big idea I want to talk about today is that because of this viewpoint that economists have, that we have limited, scarce resources. Remember that term scarcity does not mean rare. Scarce doesn't mean rare to an economist. It just means limited. And because we have unlimited wants and limited resources with which to satisfy those wants, Everybody has to make choices. Everything involves a trade-off. So everything has a cost. You have to give up something in order to get something. So if you go buy something at the store, that means there's something else that you can't afford anymore. If you decide to come to class, or if you decide to watch this video, that means there's something else that you can't be doing right now. You can't be sleeping. Maybe you could eat at the same time as watching this video, I guess. If you decide to eat a hamburger, that means there's less room in your stomach to eat a hot dog. So everything involves a choice. The richest person on earth has trade-offs. If nothing else, even if you had an infinite amount of money, you still have a limited amount of attention span, a limited amount of time, a limited amount of energy, and a limited amount of room in your stomach. So everything involves a trade-off. So when we think about these trade-offs, the term we like to think about and keep in the back of our heads when we think about making a choice, we always want to think about what we're not able to do because we made that choice. What are we giving up? And we call those things we're giving up an opportunity cost. Now, to be a little more precise about this, the opportunity cost, when we think about, well, right now you're watching a video. What would you be doing otherwise? Make a list of all the things you could be doing instead of watching this video right now. Now look at the list and pick the best thing that's not watching the video. In other words, we call that other thing the next best alternative. Now the best thing is obviously watching this video. Otherwise, you're insane, right? You should not have chosen to watch this video if there's something better that you should be doing right now. So if you made this choice, at least you thought this was the best use of your time. The second best, the next best thing, think about how much you would enjoy doing that. That is the opportunity cost. How much would you enjoy doing that second best or that next best thing, okay? So let's think about opportunity costs a little bit. Here's a question. Suppose somebody gets hurt. Now, we like to think, before we think too carefully, we like to think that, well, what's a human life worth? What's the value of a human life? Now, the answer to that question, usually people say, well, you can't put a value on it. The value of every human life is just sacred. So the value of every human life is infinite, right? Well, that can't make sense, though, because we have limited resources. We can't put an infinite amount of resources into every human life to make sure people live longer or are healthier or to lower their chances of dying down to zero, right? So given the fact that we have limited doctors, limited hospitals, limited amount of resources to spend on healthcare, suppose somebody gets injured in a car wreck. Should we do everything we can to save this person's life? We want to say yes. That's our gut instinct. We want to say yes. We should do everything possible to save this person's life. Okay, well, let's make a list of what everything would actually mean. In order to save this one person's life, we should take every doctor in the state or every doctor in the country and bring them to this one place where this one person has been injured. And we should put every doctor and every nurse and every surgeon on this one person. Of course we can't do that. Why not? Because for every doctor we put on this one person who's injured, that leaves one less doctor to take care of all the other people who are sick and injured and need doctors. So when you think about it that way, hopefully you start to see that you can't put a value of infinity on every human life. We want to somehow balance the trade-offs, balance the opportunity costs, right? So it might be that by adding one more doctor to a team that's trying to save someone's life, perhaps you could raise the chance that they're going to survive by 1%. But if that one doctor could be used somewhere else to increase the chance of someone else being saved by 10 or 20 or 30%, maybe we should leave that doctor on the other person. Let's have a look at something called the Copenhagen Consensus here. that looks at this idea in a little bit more scientific way. So if you Google the Copenhagen Consensus, what this is it's a group of economists who met in Copenhagen, and some of these people were economists, some were actually other kinds of experts like doctors, public health experts, and other kinds of scientists. But it was led by a group of economists, and what they wanted to do was look at the entire Earth and start trying to figure out, okay, suppose we had a lot of money to spend on anything, whether it's cleaning up the environment, reducing pollution, healthcare, literacy, education. We could spend this money on anything we wanted to. What are the things that we could spend money on that would lead to the largest increase in human lifespan, human flourishing, human happiness? They got 82 of the world's top economists and 44 sector experts. So these are some of those health experts and other scientists that they got. And what they wanted to do was to see, okay, suppose we took $1 and we spent it on something. How much value in return would we get for that investment of $1 in looking at a lot of different possibilities? Let's look at their findings here. So we'll look at just a couple of these things here. One of the biggest things that we could do to improve people's happiness, welfare, flourishing, prosperity, lifespan is to try to help free trade. Free trade, as we'll talk about a little later in the course, is a way to help everyone in the long run get better off. Different countries have different talents, different costs of resources. It's best if you let countries do what they're comparatively best at and then allow people to trade rather than blocking trade and forcing everyone to produce everything they need themselves. For example, what if North Carolina and the United States did not trade with Florida? Well, in North Carolina, we'd have to grow our own oranges, and that would be an incredible waste of money because we just don't have the right climate to grow oranges. So oranges would be much, much, much more expensive. So free trade turns out to be one of the biggest bang for the buck. So what this is saying here is for every $1 spent on free trade agreements, we'll get over $2,000 back. What if we could, in the whole world, guarantee universal access to contraception? For each $1 we spent on those programs, we'd get $120 back. Now, there are a lot of things we can do, and maybe things we should do, that make us feel better, but we shouldn't do them because we think that it's a good investment per se, right? It might just be the right thing to do. But one example of that is, suppose we thought child marriages were wrong. Suppose we spent money going around the world campaigning to convince governments to not allow child marriages anymore. It might be a good thing morally to do. It might be the right thing. But in terms of a payoff on investment in monetary terms, it's not going to be a good bet. So not everything we do has to have a payoff in monetary terms. That's not what we're saying. We're just saying, let's sit down and scientifically calculate for each dollar invested, what is the payback likely to be? How about investments in healthcare? Well, one of the things they found that would really pay off, let's talk about these top 3 here, would be to tell people, look, take a small aspirin every day, and that will help reduce the risk of a heart attack. Very cheap, easy thing to do. Not a lot of risk to taking just a small aspirin every day. Huge benefits. So if everybody did that, we would have huge benefits. Saving money in healthcare, saving money from avoiding people having costs for healthcare, losing their jobs, losing the support network for a family when somebody has a heart attack. Big payoffs. Expanding immunization. We should probably do it both because it's the right thing to do and because there are huge payoffs in giving people immunizations. Giving people high blood pressure medication. Also, for every $1 spent, we would expect to get about $47 in payoffs. These are huge benefits. On the other hand, things like, again, it might be the right thing to do. It might be something we choose to do. But is it a good payoff? Giving public pensions for people who aren't really that old. So instead of having to be 65 or 70 to get a pension, should we lower that to 60 or 55? Maybe we could decide to do that, but we shouldn't decide to do it because there's going to be a great payoff from doing it. Maybe we just decide it's a good thing to do for other reasons, okay? So I encourage you to look into the Copenhagen Consensus a little bit. They study all kinds of interesting things like biodiversity, spending on roads and mobile broadband, things like that, trying to reduce violence in countries, phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, and trying to calculate the payoff for those things. How about investing in renewable energy? Not a great payoff right now. Maybe in the future, maybe doing research into renewable energy would be a good thing. But actually trying to double renewable energy right now, maybe we should do it because it's the right thing, but we shouldn't do it if we think it's going to have a great payoff. We talked about this a little bit before. So one of the big things we do in economics is cost benefit analysis. And what a lot of the field of economics involves is trying to figure out what is the correct way to measure the costs and what is the correct way to measure the benefits. This is a lot of what that Copenhagen Consensus spent a lot of time, a lot of money, and used a lot of experts to try to do. Here's the cost, here's the benefit. Should we do this? Well, the basic idea there is simply to measure the cost of doing something, and if the cost is less than the benefit, then do it. But if the cost is larger, if it's going to cost us $1 million to get $100,000 in benefits, then certainly that's something that we shouldn't do. So let's look at an example here. Here are some famous people that all dropped out of college. Now, I'm a college professor. I think that not everyone, certainly, but many, many, many people should have the opportunity and go to college and expand their minds. But it's not right for everyone. And sometimes people need to weigh the costs and the benefits and decide, I shouldn't go to college or I should drop out of college. And everybody's decision is going to be different depending on their costs and benefits. So Mark Zuckerberg decided to drop out of college because he had a really good idea that he wanted to do, right? Facebook. And what would the cost have been to him of staying in college and finishing his degree? Well, he wouldn't have had the opportunity to get Facebook off the ground, at least as quickly as he did. He might have missed that opportunity and wasted the opportunity to make billions of dollars. College degree on the one hand, losing billions of dollars on the other. Doesn't seem like a good idea, right? Bill Gates similarly dropped out of college so that he could pursue developing Microsoft. Now, Bill Gates, he was a great student. He didn't drop out because he was failing anything. There's actually a story about Bill Gates. The first economics class he took was one that was offered to graduate students. And just about everybody else in the class had had many, many economics classes before, and Bill Gates took this very advanced economics class and made an A very easily. Maybe that's what caused him to drop out, because he weighed the costs and the benefits and decided, the opportunity cost, what I would give up by spending my time finishing my degree is just too high. Tiger Woods, similarly, he was spending too much time at Stanford going to class. If he dropped out, he could become a professional golfer and spend more of his time making money on the golf course. It's a rational decision. Oprah Winfrey also dropped out of college. She just had better things to do. So this doesn't mean that it's a good decision for everyone to drop out of college, but everyone should sit down and weigh the costs and the benefits. What do I really expect to get out of college? And what am I giving up by pursuing and finishing this college degree? And everyone should make the decision that's right for them, of course. So that's basic cost-benefit analysis. Weigh the costs, weigh the benefits, and make your decision. A lot of times it's more complicated than that. That's when we need to get into marginal analysis, thinking about marginal costs and marginal benefits. Anytime you hear the word marginal, I want you to replace the word marginal with the word change in or additional. So the word marginal means change in or additional. We need to use marginal cost when it's not just an all or nothing decision. We're either going to do it or we're not. Marginal analysis helps us to figure out how much of something to do. For example, it's not a question of should we spend money on healthcare. Of course we should. The right question is how much money should we spend on healthcare? We should keep spending money on healthcare as long as the additional benefit we get from spending the money is greater than or equal to the additional cost of spending money on the healthcare. And what's that cost? Well, that cost is what are we giving up that we could spend that money, spend those resources on if we didn't spend them on healthcare? So the additional benefit really comes down to how much you're willing to pay. It's the best way to measure benefits. What's something worth to you, right? Is it worth it to you to get that surgery? When it comes to not just the money, but also the time off from work and the pain and everything else and the rehabilitation, weigh those costs of the surgery with the benefits of the surgery. But also, how much surgery should you have? How many treatments should you have in a certain case? So marginal cost is just saying, well, what's the additional cost of each additional procedure, for example? What's the marginal benefit? What's the additional benefit that I should expect from this procedure? Let's look at an example using tuition at North Carolina A&T State University here. So if we look at in-state students, here's the current tuition and fee chart for taking, and this is kind of simplifying, this is assuming that every class is a 3 credit hour class. So of course, if you take no classes, your total tuition bill is going to be $0. What if we decided to take that first class? What's the additional cost of taking one class? Well, what we're asking is, what's the change in the tuition from 0 up to $1,027? The math we would do is $1,027 minus 0. So the marginal cost, the additional cost of taking that first class would be $1,027. So what if we had decided we were going to take one class? And then we asked ourselves, should I take a second class? Well, let's calculate. What's the additional cost of taking that second class? What we want to know is, I'm already paying $1,027. How much additional money would it cost me? What's the change in the cost for tuition? So we're doing $3,030 minus $1,027. Now do that on your calculator. Make sure not to just watch this, but be active and do this. So what do you get? 3,030 minus 1,027. You get $2,003. The point here is that the additional cost of taking additional classes isn't always the same thing. It changes. And then you have to think about on the other side, well, what's the additional benefit of taking another class? You'll learn more. You'll graduate faster. But the additional costs aren't just the money for tuition. There's also the books. There's also the time that you're spending and how hard it is to work on the class. We're just focusing on the money costs, but we can generalize this to all the other costs we would think about taking additional classes. So what about the third class? Well, here we're asking what's the additional cost when we go from the second class to the third class? What's $4,064 minus $3,030? $1,034. Here's what's strange. The first class is very cheap. The second class is twice as much. Why is it that the second class is twice as expensive as the first class? Very weird. But then once you're taking 2 classes, the third class is very cheap again. Doesn't make much sense, but people need to understand this if they're going to make the right choice for them. What about the cost of taking a 4th class? What's the additional cost going from $4,064 to $4,498? Well, do it on your calculator. $434. That 4th class is incredibly cheap. What about the 5th class? Well, the marginal cost is 0, right? What about a 6th class? The marginal cost in terms of tuition, at least, is also 0. What does this tell us about the world? Well, it tells us that we would probably see very few students who chose to take just 3 classes if they're paying attention here, right? Because once you've signed up for 3 classes, the 4th class is extremely cheap. So why not just go ahead and sign up for that 4th class? So there are benefits from going from 9 to 12 hours. Then you're a full-time student. And then you get all kinds of other benefits, like certain kinds of loans or other kinds of scholarships that might be available to you now that you're a full-time student. The cost is very small going from 3 to 4 classes. The benefits probably outweigh them, unless perhaps you're working full-time and you just don't have enough time to fit in another class. Now, at A&T, we used to see a lot of people, at least at the beginning of the semester, signing up for 5 or 6 classes because the additional cost of tuition was 0. We had a lot of people signing up for classes that they had no intention at all of ever completing. People would sign up for extra classes just to try them out, knowing that they were going to drop some of those classes. That's why we came up with a rule a few years ago, limiting the number of classes that you're allowed to drop. Now, a lot fewer people sign up for classes just to try them out. And the reason why we had to pass that rule was we were wasting resources. Even though there wasn't an additional cost to the student of signing up for those classes, there was an additional cost to the university. Students were taking up spots in classes that they had absolutely no intention of actually staying in. Now, take a minute and pause the video and, for practice, calculate the marginal cost of taking each additional class for out-of-state students. Just a note here before you get started is that the marginal cost, when we talk about the 0 class category, doesn't make sense to answer that question. So that's why usually we'll put a dotted line through it or just say, well, that's not applicable. Because the additional cost of taking a 0 class, it just doesn't make sense to ask that question. But for the rest of them, pause the video, calculate the marginal cost of these classes, and then we'll come back and check your answers. So here are the numbers that you should have gotten. We see a similar kind of pattern. Of course, we charge out-of-state students more than we charge in-state students, but we see a similar kind of pattern where the first class is a lot cheaper than the second class, but then the third class is cheap again. The fourth class is even cheaper. This is a little weird, giving classes away for free. Now, many private schools don't do it this way. For example, at Duke University, if you're an undergraduate student, every credit hour you take, you pay for. So for every individual credit hour, you pay $1,549 for that credit hour. So a 4-hour class costs more than a 3-hour class. And if you sign up for a class, you're paying more to sign up for that class. Now, if you're a graduate student, it costs even more per credit hour, $2,875. Now, on top of this, there are, of course, fees, just like every university has, but that's just for the credit hour. They're not going to give you anything for free. You're going to pay for it when you sign up for that additional class. And that makes a lot more sense. That system makes more sense than allowing people to sign up for classes that they're not paying for. That led to some problems. All right, let's talk about some definitions here. What is the difference between a positive statement and a normative statement? A positive statement is sometimes called a statement of fact. So a statement of fact. But it's a little more complicated than that. A normative statement, on the other hand, is a statement of opinion or a value judgment. Here's the real difference. This is the way most textbooks discuss this, but here's a more clear way to think about positive versus normative statements. When we talk about a positive statement and we say a statement of fact, what we really mean is that this statement is either right or wrong and it's testable. A normative statement, on the other hand, is an opinion or a value judgment, and it is not testable. There's no way to see if it's right or wrong by collecting data. So statements of fact are either going to be something like, the unemployment rate is 10%. Well, that's either true or false, and we could go collect data and we could test that, right? That's a positive statement. Another kind of positive statement is like an if-then statement. For example, if unemployment rate goes up, then GDP will go down. That's a positive statement. It might be true, it might be false, but we could collect some data and we could test that idea to see, is that a correct statement or not? Where people sometimes get confused with positive statements when you just call it a statement of fact is this word fact makes us think that it has to be true. So, for example, if I were to say, it's snowing outside, that's a statement of fact. It's a positive statement, even if it's not snowing outside, right? So I could be lying to you. The thing that makes it a positive statement isn't that it's true. It's that we can test to see if it's true. A normative statement, on the other hand, would be something like, the unemployment rate's too high. Well, that's your opinion that it's too high. Maybe it's too high, maybe it's too low, maybe it's just right. There's no way to check to see if it's too high or too low. It's too hot in this room. Well, I don't know. Maybe it's just right for me, maybe it's just too hot for you. Unemployment is bad. Well, I mean, that's a judgment. We can't test to see if it's good or bad. We can measure some things to make arguments about whether it's good or bad, but there's no way to check to just see, is it good, is it bad? So those are all normative statements, things that say things are too high, too low, things are good or bad, or things like we should lower unemployment, we should pay more to people who are unemployed. These are opinions. There's no way to test to see if that's true or false. Now, given that economics is a social science, we use the scientific method. So we just want to briefly review some of the ideas of the scientific method. Hopefully you've heard about some of these ideas before. But the scientific method basically says you come up with a hypothesis, and a hypothesis is a proposition that we think might be true, right? So it's a proposition, and what we're going to do is we're going to test that idea. We're going to go, after we make our hypothesis, we're going to collect some data, come up with a way to test that hypothesis, and if that hypothesis stands the test of the data, stands the test of time, usually we'll call it an economic theory. And once something becomes tested so much that it's really reliable, we're pretty darn sure that this is right, we call that an economic principle or economic law. So theories, principles, laws, these are all things that we use in economics to try to decide. Once we learn these principles, we can use them to try to guide our judgments about what likely results of policy changes might be. So if we raise the minimum wage, what will happen? Well, we have some theories about that. We have some economic principles that help guide our judgment in guessing what will happen. It's an educated guess, and it guides our judgment about what might happen. But again, telling the future is kind of a risky thing to get into. An economic model is something we create when we combine a few different economic laws or economic principles together to describe a certain kind of situation. So a labor market, for example, we might come up with a simple set of principles about how businesses respond in various circumstances, about how potential and current employees respond to various changes in their environment, and then try to make predictions about how a certain government policy might change things. A few examples here are supply and demand. Everybody's heard about that. We're going to study that in Chapter 3. And in our next video, we're going to look at budget lines and production possibilities curves, which are two simple models that combine some economic principles to focus on the idea of opportunity costs, to look at this idea of trade-offs. Another couple of things to mention about these economic principles that we're talking about here is that when we talk about an economic principle, usually what we're talking about is an average tendency or an average effect of people's behavior. For example, one economic law, we call the law of demand, says that if you raise the price of something, people will buy less. The law of demand, raise the price, people will buy less. And that doesn't mean that when the price goes up that everyone will buy less, but on average, in general, we're going to see people buying less. There might be some people who can't buy less for some reason or another, though, okay? There might be exceptions to the rule. Another important term that we're going to use a lot in economics class is what we call the ceteris paribus assumption. Ceteris paribus. Repeat it with me. Ceteris paribus. Some people will pronounce this Latin phrase caeteris paribus. Latin's a dead language. We don't know how they pronounced it, but most people will pronounce this ceteris paribus. Sometimes we'll call this the other things equal assumption. In Latin, ceteris means everything and paribus equal. So everything equal. How we use this is to limit the influence of other things that might happen when we're trying to make a prediction about the future. Here's an example of how we might use this statement. Ceteris paribus, that means holding everything else constant. If the government raises the minimum wage, we would expect unemployment to go up. So ceteris paribus, assuming nothing else changes, what other things might we not want to change? Well, we want to assume that when I'm making this prediction that we're not going to have a third world war, right? We want to assume that there's not a huge volcanic eruption or an asteroid hits the Earth. Now, these are extreme examples, but it's impossible to make a prediction if at the same time we're raising the minimum wage and the government is cutting spending and we're getting rid of half the military and we are raising the pensions for old age people and we're increasing spending on healthcare. If there are 100 other important changes going on at the same time, that might interfere with the prediction we're making about the impact of the minimum wage. So ceteris paribus, if the only thing that's changing is we're raising the minimum wage, then we can make a statement. The unemployment rate will probably go up because when the wage goes up, businesses aren't going to be able to afford as many employees, and so they'll let some of those employees go and maybe replace them with machines instead, right? So ceteris paribus, if nothing else changes, if we raise the minimum wage, unemployment should increase. Now, many models, instead of using words, we will illustrate these models graphically. And that's what we're going to look at in the next video with budget lines and production possibilities curves. These are graphs that help us illustrate some of these economic principles. And an economic model is usually a simplified version of economic reality. We don't make our example that we're talking about in a model as complicated as the real world can be, because anything can happen in the real world. So we usually make things as simple as humanly possible while we can still illustrate that example. So just to recap that idea, what does ceteris paribus mean? It means holding all else constant or all else equal. Other things equal assumption. Why do we care about it? Why is it useful? Because it helps us make predictions while making assumptions that we're just changing one important thing at a time. Because if we're going in and we're changing 3 or 10 or 20 things at a time, that makes it really hard to figure out what the likely outcome would be. Okay, so that's the end of this video. As I said, in our next video, we're going to look at budget lines and production possibilities curves, and you're going to want to have a ruler or an index card and probably some colored pencils along with us. Just like with this, you're going to want to print out the handouts and work them along with me so that you can fully understand and be involved with what we're talking about. So I look forward to seeing you in the next video. If you have any questions, write them down for office hours or post them into the discussion board. I wish you good luck. Bye-bye.